Welcome again, everyone. My name is Izzy Fuqua. I'm the Adult Programs Coordinator for the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts, and we're delighted to have you here for the virtual symposium, the Kamoinge Workshop, Collaboration, Community, and Photography. This is the third of 7 weeks of talks with the Kamoinge Workshop artists. And tonight we are thrilled to be exploring the connection between one artist, Sean Walker, and film. So we will be hearing tonight from a panel made up of Alan Siegel, Dr. Sarah Eckhart, and Sean Walker. So we won't waste any time, and I'll just introduce our speakers now. Sean Walker was one of the founding members of the Kamoinge Workshop. He was a photo editor for the Black Photographers Annual and a co-founder of the International Black Photographers. Now primarily a videographer, Walker still lives in Harlem, where he documents jazz concerts at Marcus Garvey Park, as well as the annual African American Day Parade and the annual Harlem Street Baptismal United House of Prayer, as well as gallery openings and art lectures as part of his commitment to recording and preserving Black culture as a cultural anthropologist and photo artist. Joining Sean is Alan Siegel, a filmmaker, visual artist, author, teacher, and a founding member of the documentary film collective Newsreel, and formerly a co-director of Third World Newsreel. His films have been screened at international festivals and on television. His photographs and video installations have been exhibited at museums and galleries in the United States and around the world. He lives in Budapest. Thank you, Alan, for staying up late for us, and teaches at the Intermedia Department at the Hungarian University of Fine Arts. Please join me in welcoming Sean, Sarah, and Alan.
Good.
Thank you very much, Izzy. And I want to say a couple of thank yous here at the beginning. While this is the third night of the Kamoinge Symposium, which we have turned virtual, it is also the first night of the Africana Film Festival here in Richmond. It is the 5th anniversary of the Africana Film Festival, and they needed to go virtual just like we needed to go virtual. And the evening's events really came together beautifully, lined up beautifully, as Angeline Moon, director of the Africana Film Festival, has seen these films and shared her enthusiasm and was a part of the initial planning when we were going to do an in-person symposium. So I am delighted to welcome anybody who is here participating in the Africana Film Festival as well as the Kamoinge Symposium. And I especially want to thank JT Takagi and Roseli Torres at Third World Newsreel, who've been so supportive of this evening of this program, and thank them for their dedication in preserving and digitizing so many, all of these early newsreel films. So thank you very much. And with that, we can begin. Let's begin our conversation. Thank you. So, thought for the structure of the evening, we have a 1968 was an epic year, and we have 3 film clips around 1968. But I thought we could begin, Sean, as we've done with each of the Kamoinge photographers that we have talked with during the symposium, by asking you to talk a little bit. Let me make sure I can advance a little bit about how you got into photography, your early photographs, and the Kamoinge workshop before we transition to how you got into film. So can you tell us who's on the screen?
Yes, this is my uncle Hoover. He was like my main influence in him. He was sort of he took pictures mainly around the bars. And I kind of hung out with him. He was around the house. So I actually went to high school because of him. That was my first foray into photography. But Hoover was somebody I admired, and he was my brother and I. So Hoover took, I think he took guidance over me. So he would let me hang out with him. So by him hanging out in the bars, I got used to that kind of street life and that flamboyance. Everybody dressed in their finest. And here it comes over. And I think when the Polaroid first came out, that really exploded in the Black community. So he would go in and charge $1 a shot. And I think in 2 days, 3 days, he would make $1,000. I mean, he would make some good money at that. So that was my first entree into photography. After going to high school for photography, I think one of the friends in 17th Street got me involved, telling me that there's a group of photographers meeting, and that I want to come. And that's a picture. I always laugh when I see that. That's a picture of me in the late 50s at photographers meeting. I guess I tried to call myself a hustler. And that term, I think, varies between now and what young people call themselves now. But hustling in my day was either people, and that's what I was into. My day was call myself play cards, sold drugs, or were thieves, that they went into major department stores and stole stuff. So and I forgot marijuana and sold marijuana. So I kind of went to, that was my image of after being out with Hoover, that this is what I wanted to do with my life. So here I am with this Italian stuff on, and this is one of my mentors, Bow-Legged Bobby. He kind of sort of showed me, if you're gonna do this, kid, this is the way you make some money, kind of thing. And he really was a kind guy. He really liked young people. I was pretty much close to his age, but he would supply money for the basketball team, for bus. Really was. This is a period where the hustle, so to speak, gave back to the community, gave back to the community kids. They bought turkeys, they bought things for Thanksgiving, for Christmas. And, I remember there was another one of the hustlers called Albuquerque, that at the end of his writing numbers days, that he would take all the change he had in his pocket and throw it up in the air and let everybody scramble for money. So that's my background. And so I kind of really, 17th Street I come up on 117th Street, was more of a family for me, that you got to know people really closely. And when I got to get into the Kamoinge workshop, because I used to bring those guys into 117th Street to see how I lived. Now, again, most of these young guys had been to college or the military, and I was straight off I was straight off the block, okay? So this is one of the earlier pictures of Kamoinge, the founding members. The brother with his back turned was Earl James. The reason why his back was turned, because he was a member, but ceased to be a member. And ceased to be a member. So we were going to have an exhibition. So we said, okay, you're going to be in the exhibition, but you're not going to be in the photograph. So that's what that whole thing was about. It was about him agreeing to say, okay, I want to be in the exhibition, but I'll just cover my face. So that's how this is all of us in our 20s. And at the time, the majority of us lived in Harlem. Herb Randall lived on the Lower East Side. I think Buford Buford might have been living in Harlem, but everybody else other than Alf and I lived in Jersey at the time. But Kamoinge was a Harlem-based group. So out of the 12 of us, maybe 10 of us come out of walking distance to each other's house. So we became more like family, almost, that we saw each other on a regular basis. We saw each other in groups. We saw each other as individuals. So I could go shooting with Ray, or I could go shooting with Lou, or I could go shooting with Buford or Herbie. So for me, I was probably only having high school photography. I was probably the less experienced in the field. I grew up around photography, but never took it that serious. But Kamoinge was, for me, that was my Sorbonne. That was me going to Paris and learning the most profound stuff because you had guys that had traveled to Europe, people who had been uh, researchers in Black culture. So there was a lot of information that I gleaned from Kamoinge. So that's where my footprint starts at, Kamoinge, and my beginning as an artist. This was a statement that Lou Draper wrote. Anybody see that? Can you, Sarah, can you read that out loud
Yes,
for
so
everybody?
these are meeting minutes from 1964, April of 1964. And we have more of the notes, and over several weeks in April, Lou Draper was recording that you were having a discussion about the direction that Kamoinge would take. And here at point 7, he wrote, discussion on direction completed and theme established for the Black artist, and from this, better enlightenment of the Black community.
There's one thing that was really important for us was that we considered ourselves artists, more so than just photographers. And I think that was important for us because we bridged more gaps by considering ourselves as artists. So in the group, I learned to study the filmmaking, studied painting, I studied all this stuff. So we went to see all the filmmakers, the Italian filmmakers and the Russian filmmakers and the Spanish filmmakers and the Swedish filmmakers and the Japanese filmmakers. And so at some point, we'd gotten a profound sense of who we were, who our community was, and what we considered the best way at some point in the community, and trying to show us in a positive light. And, you know, because all of us grew up who we were, who was the community, and trying to show hope on looking at Life magazine and Time magazine and all look at, and they never showed families the way we saw families. I think it was like when we saw Roger Garaba's Sweet Fly Paper of Light. That's what we tried to do with the families the way Black photographers and we tried to deal with trying to show the positive side of our community. That's what we tried to do with show the people that we knew every day that was struggling. We tried to educate their children and to have their children make something of themselves. This is a picture of my godson. Unfortunately, he showed the people that we knew every race kids to educate their children. I think he died in his 20s, maybe early 30s. Unfortunately, disease took him. But I think what we were trying to do, and I spent most of my career photographing 117th Street. So my venue was from 117th Street to 125th Street. That was my kind of, I think he died in his 30s on street. So my venue was from 100, get 3-4 rolls of film, go downstairs and photographing 117th Street. So I'm on the block, just photographing the people on the block. I found them so interesting. And it was, I think they, interestingly enough, other than my uncle that took some pictures that go downstairs to go somewhere, they had not had pictures taken of them. Get 3-4 rolls of property that became localized where people could afford to buy them. Before Kodak came, people went out with their inexpensive cameras. You had to go somewhere, and people don't remember that time. So there were, back in the day, there were very few families that had pictures of themselves unless they were to a professional photographer. They did not have pictures to that part of one of my roles, just taking pictures of the streets, not thinking about history as much, but just taking inexpensive cameras.
Yeah.
So I consider that pictures. Okay, again, this is Harlem back in the day, but just taking pictures. Harlem community. One of my earlier girlfriends lived in this block, so I was able to have free reign where people, okay, again, the Harlem community taking pictures. So and one of my earlier girlfriends to shoot the community than it is a free reign where people it was really trying to shoot the community. I shoot events like they mentioned earlier. I shoot there's a baptism they have on 115th Street that I shoot. I shoot the community they have on Puerto Rican Day Parade. I shoot cultural events to one photograph people who want to look their best, show their best sides off. This is one of the programs where I was working in the Bronx and one of the programs up there, and I shot this in the Bronx because I was up there a while before I went to Cuba, 1966. Any questions, Sarah? And this
Well,
is another series that one.
I had a slide for you. You talked about it a little bit. I thought we could transition from your photography to your film, and you brought it up by talking about how important film was. You and Tony made this list for me because both of you, when you talked about Kamoinge as a university and a college, and both you and Tony have used that often, talked about how important both, I think it was Lou Draper and Al Fanar were in encouraging you to see a lot of film. And so this is the list you put together of the films that you saw and talked about at Kamoinge meetings. Which isn't...
Yeah, I think that what happens is when I talk about people about Kamoinge, and they kind of look at us as a photo club, which we never saw ourselves as. I think when Roy first came to Kamoinge, and again, this is for me, because I'm the youngest, probably one of the youngest members of Kamoinge, and the least experienced, that Roy said something about, you guys are trying to be artists, want to be artists. And that was the first time I did that term related to somebody Black. Especially me, I'm sort of the kind of outside guy, and I'm here. And is that what I'm trying to do, is art? So I think that this list of film gives you a sense of what we were doing our homework, that we wanted to see what was out there in film and painting and sculpture, that, there was no limitations to our degree of study, that we wanted to see what that was out there, which was really important. And another thing about it, we all had to read certain books. I remember that Eisenstadt did a book called The Film Form and Sculpture, for the film sense. I don't know if anybody ever read it. But it was the most difficult book I had ever tried to read, and I mean tried to read. But so I said, well, I'll try to read this, but I better look at more films to get a sense of who he was and his approach. So I think that's what this list, Tony Barbosa and myself, talked about, the films that we were, and this is the thing that we had a meeting back when we started in the 60s period, we met every Sunday. Mm-hmm. So somebody came back every Sunday and said something about, I saw this film, go see it. I read this book, go see it. So we always, Barbosa and myself, talked about the thing that we had a meeting with about what the child next. In the 60s period, this was about, and I think this is, and said something about, I saw this. So we always had at some point I wanted to learn how to do filmmaking. And I think the next photograph talks about the first film screening I went to. It was on the Lower East Side. It was Andy, there's Jonas Meeker. We all had to read certain books, I remember that. And there was another filmmaker called Penny Baker. I just sat there with film, skills expression. I had to say that, again, I come from 117th Street. I think that's what this list had, a black neighborhood, and black neighborhood. And to see what they were doing, I read this book. We always had some input, this was about, and I think this is what filmmaking. And I think the next, so I called Penny Baker filmmaking, and I had to say that and say, this is what filmmaking is in the black neighborhood all my life. To me. I couldn't get my point was, now again, I don't know how I got to third world Israel. And again, point was now again, I don't know, most people don't know what BAI played for the community at some time, right? But it was an important vehicle. And this is, I'm going to turn it over to Alan for a minute because this is one of the films that he worked on. Go ahead, Alan.
Oh, this is a this is what I consider like my first real film. I made this film when I was living in Baltimore. I brought it up to New York to screen for some people in New York, and I met Ken Jacobs, who was a filmmaker who was running the Millennium Film Workshop on the Bowery, and I showed him this film. He liked the film a lot, and he said, "Why don't you teach a film workshop?" I'd never taught a film workshop in my life. I didn't know what it meant to actually teach anything, you know. But anyway, Ken said there's a thing called the Free University of New York on 14th Street, and why don't you go introduce yourself to some people there? I'll like set things up for you, and you can start a filmmaking workshop. And I started a filmmaking workshop there. I met Sean there. That's how we came together, because Sean was one of the people who was part of the workshop. And out of that workshop came Newsreel, actually, you know, because one of the people who was part of the workshop, I don't know if you remember him, Melvin. You remember Melvin, Sean?
Yeah.
Melvin was part of the workshop, and somehow Melvin had the connection to Jonas. Okay, so Melvin was the bridge between the film workshop on 14th Street and Jonas Mikas, who was doing his writing his column in the Village Voice and really promoting a lot of like experimental avant-garde filmmakers at that time. But that was an important connection. So that's a little bit of the background.
And so your workshop was one of the workshop really was an integral contribution to the first meeting of the newsreel, which Jonas Mikas talks about in the kind of documents in the Village Voice movie journal column, December 22nd. Do either of you remember that initial meeting?
Oh yes, the initial meeting was over on. Go ahead, Sean. Go ahead.
No, go ahead. You no, because I don't remember it very well, but I think what I remember is that Alan ran a funny kind of workshop. It was really interesting because I think I was there maybe the second week, and he gave me a 16. Alan ran a funny film with this. I'm saying, man, are these people crazy? What are they giving me this camera? You know, I come out of a place where people never return things. But you know, it was the first film that I shot on 117th Street. It's somewhere in Third World archives. But I think I had the experience. The difference in the people in the class was that a lot of them were novice people who wanted to learn how to film. At least I had 2 or 3 years of photography under my belt. So that made it easier for Alan to see what my potential was. And the fact that we became really, really good friends. 2 or 3 years of photography, Alan and the families kind of raised together. So we kind of spent a lot of time together working on films. And what happens is that Alan and I kind of worked on a lot of the Third World Newsreel projects. But I think on our own. It was Alan and me. I was cameraman, I was the interviewer and the sound man. And that's some of the major part of Third World Newsreel, other than the larger, when we had the larger things, when we did the march on the Pentagon and things like that. But you can tell them more about 2 or 3 years out.
Yeah, by by today's standards and by the kind of equipment that people have access to these days, you know, we were very, very primitive in terms of what we had. We had a Bolex, you know, the camera that Sean is talking about. It was like we had a Bolex, and we had, I don't even remember what kind of tape recorder we had, but we didn't have a sync camera, you know. We only had we were only able to record film and sound separately. So we had to, like all of the early newsreel films that Sean and I worked on, and you'll see like in IS 201 and Community Control, and these films were made um, almost experimentally, trying to work together the images and the sound to make some kind of coherent statement about the reality that we were confronting. Does that sound about right, Sean?
Yeah, I think what they called it that at that time was called guerrilla filmmaking. We were revolutionaries doing guerrilla filmmaking, you know, and we had the old Bell and Howell. You remember those brown Bell and Howell 16 millimeters? I think they used in the military.
Yes,
that's what we had a few of them, and we used those suckers. So it was more than, for me, it was more than I could ask for, to learn that most of my experience was like on the job. Somebody would say, here, take this and use it. And that's how I learned. So I was fortunate enough to be exposed to filmmaking. And at some points I moved to Black Journal because Alan knew people at Black Journal. Black Journal was a TV program, what I guess now they call a white paper report on the South. And they hired, there were a few Black filmmakers, myself, Leroy Lucas, Sinclair Bourne, and maybe a couple of other, but the three of us were like filmmakers and directors for Black Journal, and we traveled to the South to photograph the news, what was happening in the South, and maybe a couple of them up in New York City. So those experiences from going to see this film with Jonas Mikas and all those guys, to meeting out Black Journal, and we traveled to Black Journal, and then from Black Journal to Cuba.
So,
right. This is again going to see this film with Black Street. Sarah, are you about to say something?
No, I was just going to say that when we talked about these, you were talking. We're having a little feedback issue with your audio, but we'll. I think it's just speeding up and going back. But at any rate, with these photographs, we were talking a little bit about. You were telling me a little bit about how you realized you had a different perspective to show when you talked about guerrilla filmmaking, shooting what you were seeing in front of you. You had a different perspective from many of the other filmmakers since you were based in Harlem. And so I thought maybe you might want to talk a little bit about that.
Well, Sarah, I think that I was trying to talk about that my whole entree into photography was as an artist. Mm-hmm. From hit the ground running, that's what I thought I was. That's what I was trying to be, and representing myself that way. So I got all these visual films as my background to how Fellini saw things and Buñuel saw things, and I forgot the Swedish director who saw. I mean, so you got these images. So I went into shooting documentary filmmaking with a photo library of images, what things looked like when positions were right, when lighting was right, when things that most photographers most of them are hung up in the technical part of photography. My thing was hung up in the artistic part of photography. And I think that's what separated Kamoinge from a lot of the other photographic groups and some of the other photographers, is that we understood art. We were trying to achieve there was a thing called the decisive moment we all worked on. Cartier-Bresson, a lot of the other photographers, senior photographers did it, where you tried to take a picture that told its own story. That you didn't have to tell somebody, well, I was trying to do this and I was trying to do that, where people saw it in the photograph. When you look at Cartier-Bresson's photographs, either they make you smile or you get sad because of what's happening, but you don't have to be told about what he's trying to do. I forgot, there's another contemporary French photographer, and I haven't mentioned his name in a while, but another one that were literally storytellers, but had art training. And I think you can always tell the difference between a photographer who went to photography school and a photographer who went to art school, painting school, studied painting. There's a difference in their approach, and there's a difference in their ideas and how they shoot different subject matter. Personally, that's what I believe. I think that's what has taken my work and separated me from a lot of other guys that came up around me, and we all kind of took pictures together. But somehow or another, people recognized that I had a style. I didn't know it, but I did. So I think that's what I took into filmmaking. I think that's what I saw, because I saw it when he first saw my stills. I think that's what happened when I came to class. I showed him my stills and he saw something in the work and said, hey, take a camera, go out and shoot something. All right. I've been fortunate that way that I think I was the last person to realize that I had a talent. I think everybody else realized it before I did. All right.
So
does that answer your question, Sarah?
I didn't hear your last, what did you say at the end, Sean?
I said, I think everybody recognized I had a talent because he's someone other than myself.
So I am shifting us. One of the people who I think saw you had talent was Lou Draper. And one of the reasons that I knew that you had done films for Third World, or it was called the Newsreel, and then it became the Third World Newsreel in the 70s. So I knew you had done films from the Newsreel, but I didn't know a lot about it. And I found this negative strip. This is a positive of a negative strip in Louis Draper's archive. Well, I didn't find it by myself. I worked with a great team, archivist and research assistant Treya Cochran. But I was thinking about the school segregation that Louis Draper had experienced in the South. And that's what I was actually, at this present moment, I'm thinking, what does he have in his negatives about the South? And I came across a protest image, and Lou did not, there are not a lot of protest images in his negatives. But I came across this one, and we were, through technology, able to make a positive and enlarge it. And I saw the signs that the protesters were holding, which said community control of community schools. And then this one, which gave me a sense of location, it said New York City Board of Ed, Mississippi style. And then Lou had written, I think, in front of IS, that this was happening in front of IS 201. So this, all of a sudden I had a story. And separately, I was looking through Third World Newsreel's website looking for your films, and I saw one titled Community Control of Community Schools. And then Alan told me, I think, that you had worked on IS 201 and Report from Newark. And so all of this kind of came together, and that's really the kernel of what tonight's films are about, was the sense that all of this overlap between the Kamoinge workshop, your photography, your films, what the Kamoinge workshop was doing, and what Third World Newsreel was doing. And so these first two films that, so we're gonna show now, Community Control of, we're gonna show, sorry, I've got myself out of order. We're gonna show Intermediate School 201, IS 201, and Report from Newark first. And then after a little discussion, we will show community control of community schools. So before we put on this it's about 8-minute film about Intermediate School 201, which is filming the Malcolm X Memorial Day Parade on February 21 in 1968, and then a memorial event that was held inside Intermediate School 201. Is there anything you, Sean, or Alan want to say to just set up a little bit what the viewer is going to see?
Sean, you want to?
Alan. No, Alan, say something.
This was, I mean, there was a connection between when we made this film, when we started working on this film, there was a connection between IS 201 and Report from Newark, because the report from Newark was based on the way that the Newark riots were represented in the newspapers. So we wanted to create, we wanted to make a report from Newark, which was the people who were involved in the rebellion in Newark, and to have them talk about what had actually happened, rather than the way that it was being presented in the mainstream media. And there's a connection between the memorial that took place at IS 201, because the way that was represented also was basically through the point of view of a white-controlled media, you know, and they saw what had happened in Newark from a very particular kind of lens, in the same way that the whole events at the IS 201 were being presented, and which later you will see connects with the community control of the schools. So all of these events and representation of reality was coming from a very particular kind of perspective, okay? You can say like that the perspective that was being presented was a very whitewashed kind of perspective, okay? As opposed to like the reality of people in these two different communities.
And one other thing that we've learned, and I'll show a clipping of the New York Times article review when I'm on the other side of the film, is that media and photographers were not allowed into the event that's going to be at the center of this film. So Sean, I think you were there, you shot this footage, and I don't know who else has this. So as we hit play, you know, we have this film because you were there filming from the inside when the media and photographers were not allowed into the event. Okay.
Before you do that, I just wanted to mention one part of it is that, fortunately, that it came a time where organizations had stopped white media from coming in, because a lot of times we as Black reporters or filmmakers were not allowed in certain sets. I put out of sets where they had Black people speaking, and they said, you don't have a press card, you ain't in the union, so you got to get out. So I think Herman Ferguson was a part of this, and I think that was interesting for them to just say, hey, no white press. And I think that was a part that, and it happened for a while, where we as a community stopped the white press, because that was the white press entree into this thing. Well, if you want to, if you wanted to be on the news this evening, then you got to let us in. And people said, hey, no, it doesn't have to be on the news this evening, and we don't have to let you in. So I just wanted to say that, because that's an interesting point that you brought up.
Yeah. Okay, and we're going to intro in. What you'll be hearing is an Amiri Baraka poem as we enter into this film.
One of the things that I wanted to say, Alan, was that if it didn't be for the federal money that came into the Black communities, and that was Bronx, Brooklyn, Manhattan, I don't know about other regions, but it was how you acted. I started to work with my first photography job And as a member of Kamoinge, I was able to get up there, and I got a job as a newspaper reporter. And I think that was the beginning of my career and the beginning of my training. And I realized that I told all the students that I've ever taught that one of the things that created that was the people who voted and voted the Kennedys in. And for that period of time, I got to know everybody. That with all this federal money, there was always some kind of program. There was a Summer in the City, How You Act, Brooklyn was Youth in Action. There was all these programs that were going around, and we could hone our skills, shoot. That's how everybody was shooting videos, shooting stills. And there's a collection of work of the Black community in the 60s and 70s that's just to be uncovered. So I just wanted to say that.
I think that's a really important part, Sean. I think the funding is something we don't talk enough about, because we talk about the timeline of Kamoinge often, and how you guys did a lot in the 1960s, you had exhibitions in the 70s, and then in the 80s, it gets a lot quieter, and that is in part because everybody was focusing on their careers, but it's also because a lot of the funding went away, and funding is enormously important for exhibitions to happen, for artists to have grants to make work. And I think you've made that point before, and I think it's an excellent point to be made. So Alan, we talked a little bit, you touched on this already, but the reason I had this slide here was the contrast of the New York Times reporting on February 23rd on what we just saw at Intermediate School 201 versus what was happening. Do you want to say anything else? Because I think that's so much at the heart of what the newsreel was doing, was providing an alternative perspective.
I think the important point is that Sean mentioned this earlier, is that as well, is that, you know, if you were not on the evening news, if you were not on Channel 4 or Channel 2, and you were involved in some kind of like project or some kind of activity or some kind of protest or whatever, is that you didn't exist, you know? Your reality was like completely invisible, okay? And when we started making these films, it was not just to document these different events and issues. It was also we brought these films into the community, okay? We created a distribution network that showed the films to people in the community. One of the things that I think we realized early on is like a lot of schools had 16mm projectors, okay? So schools had 16mm projectors, and that meant that they could screen something that we created, okay? So that they would see a reflection of their own reality and not seeing it off the tube at 6 o'clock in the evening, which was, and there was two different realities, okay? So what Kamoinge, the workshop was doing was validating and creating, making visible a reality that was not filtered through the lens of the mainstream media. So, and this is like really important because we have the same issue, we're confronted with the same issues today, you know? So it's not like, oh, everything disappeared, you know? If that woman in Minneapolis was not holding her cell phone in front of George Floyd, you know, no one would know that event took place, okay? And we can see the ramifications when people see a reality like that being broadcast all over the world, and how that changes people's perception of the role of the police in Black communities, okay? And this is part of what we were trying to do also. And I think many ways we succeeded in doing that, okay?
Yeah, yes. And before we're gonna watch community control of community schools, which perfectly illustrates what you just said. But before we do that, Sean, you had found photographs that I think you made between IS-201, which would have been February 1968, and community control of community schools. A lot of that footage, I think, was taken in September of 1968. This right here puts us in about April of 1968. So do you want to just tell us a little bit about this? These are your photographs, but then you and Alan worked on a film called Columbia Revolt.
Yeah, well, I just discovered these stills because I worked on Columbia Revolt. And I just wanted to say something too, because it was the first time it had happened to me, that I went there to cover it as an assignment on my own. I didn't, you know, we were all like independents. So we heard about a demonstration, we went there, and I'm geared up. And at some point, I got caught up into the demonstration and the reasons for the demonstration. And I remember putting my cameras away, just putting them out into the demonstration. Was supposed to do more than just take pictures. That, you know, like you say, you have to be in it to win it. You had to be a part of this demonstration because this is about you and your future and your children's future. And I think that was the reality what happened. But I was able to do these stills of the students that took over one of the buildings at Columbia, that the footage that I shot didn't have many of the Black students in it. But I just discovered these, that they were part of the leadership of the at Columbia. And because it was Columbia trying to spread its wings into the lower, they were up on the hill, so they were trying to come down the hill and take over properties in, you know, in my community to build a gymnasium that was going to be for primarily white students. So I put this, I wanted to put these in because I wanted to show that there was a lot of leadership and organization amongst Black students and Black politicals who organized that demonstration. Pretty much that's what I wanted to say about that. And I think, Sarah, you can tell them that they can see the film, the Columbia film, and these were like maybe a handful of stills that I took. I was trying to get more to Sarah, but I wanted to let them know that, because if you see the whole film, you don't get a sense that the students played that much of a major, Black students played that much of a major role, where they were the leadership of that demonstration. And it was about the Black community down below Broadway, that they were going to build this gymnasium and take brownstones and take out single family, not single family, but multi-family dwellings to build this gymnasium that Black folks weren't going to be able to use. That's it.
Good. So we're going to send an email after the symposium. Everybody who's watching now will get an email, and there will be a link. We're so grateful to Third World Newsreel for this. There will be a link with a password. We're not going to show that film tonight, in part because there ended up being a lot less footage that of the students in the stills you're talking about. We're not going to show that tonight, but the viewers can watch that later through this link. So again, thank you to Third World Newsreel for providing that, and it will be available for 1 week until September 24th. So look for that email tomorrow. Instead, we're going to return to community control of community schools, which is really, I think of almost, I mean, such a related film to the IS-201 film. But we've moved forward now to September. I don't know, and you guys can tell me this. I don't know how long you took this footage for. I know that the main events took place in September of 1968. But again, this is, and when we're done with the film, I think we could talk a little bit about the editing process too, because but do you want to, Alan, do you want to give us a little bit of a lead into the fact that we're going to come in, actually, I should also explain it. about halfway through community control of community schools, because it is 38 minutes long, which was too long. We're going to watch the second half of it, but it really has all the themes in it. Alan, do you have? Yeah.
No, I think we should look at the film, but I just want to say that there was like so many different things happening in '68 that, and newsreel had just really gotten on its feet at the beginning of '68. So we were trying to cover as many things that we thought were important to be documented, and well, a lot of this we were playing by ear. You know, it was like we were trying to figure out like how do we work. We didn't have like one style. You know, there was no like formula in terms of what we were trying to do. You know, each film had their own had its own personality, and which was depended on the people who worked on it. But let's look at the film, because I think the film says a lot.
It does say a lot. Okay, here we go.
Doesn't look like anything different from now, right?
So people have, yeah, I've already gotten a text. I think it looks very, I think this is important for people to see now.
Yeah, well, the fact that it's continually going on for this, if it's not community control, it's the control of our lives, because that's what the bottom line is. That's what this is all about. You know, people getting shot because, hey man, they're standing in front of stoops, selling cigarettes. You know, so it hasn't changed much. We have a history, we have a document of what they've done to us all these years, and way back in slavery. So for people to say that what we're doing now in the demonstrations, they can't understand why people are angry. All they have to do is look at history, you know, and they can tell why we're angry. You know, so sometimes it's very difficult to look at this material, because at some points we shot this stuff, we thought it would make a change, and we look at the streets now and it still hasn't changed. That I think it's now because there's more media coverage, and like you said, people have more cameras, that the atrocities that are done towards us are just ever present in the news, and it still makes people still kind of wonder what do we want? People can ask you, what do you want? I don't know. But just,
Well,
Alan, what do you think?
No.
Sarah, you gonna say something?
no, Alan, you go ahead.
No, I mean, I hadn't seen these films for quite a while, and then looking at them today and seeing some of the comments that people have made, it is sobering, you know, and it's like, it's more than depressing. It's like you realize how entrenched the power structure is in terms of the way that the communities across the country are controlled and manipulated, and that really hasn't happened a lot. You know, I mean, one of the things is that Sean mentioned this earlier in terms of like the funding, and federal funding enabled people to go out and create work that reflected their reality in the communities, you know, and gave people a toolbox of skills to be able to document their reality, you know, and develop those skills without having to fit them into some kind of formula. And what we see today is still this, not just the same reality, but the same formulas being applied in even worse in terms of like the communities across the U.S. You know, yes.
One of the
You know, it's
concrete.
one thing that,
Go ahead, Sean.
pardon me?
Go
Yeah,
ahead.
well, I'm looking at this thing that one of the results of that demonstrations that we did have back then was this program that Ray Francis and Herb Randall and Lou Draper created at IS 201, where they actually wrote the curriculum, videoed the curriculum, showed the curriculum inside of the school. But that was one, you know, and there were other programs like that happened like that. But as soon as the money stopped, they took those programs right away. You know, that one of the things I remember, because when I was working with the first thing that people had gotten these jobs in these programs, and when they wanted to get rid of them, they said, well, where's your degrees? Well, but I've been working here for 15 years, but where's your degree? I don't have one. I didn't need one when I got this job, and now I've been doing it, and everything has been satisfactory, but you still don't have a degree. So now I remember I worked at Empire State where people were having to go back to get degrees at, you know, 50 years old, 60 years old to maintain a job because the funding had run out. And now you can't get these jobs unless you have a degree. So we're always put in that position where, you know, you never have enough to get over, you know, but I think that this, the ISO1 program was one of the successful programs, and particularly in Manhattan. And again, Kamoinge was in the forefront. And I taught for close to 40 years. My last job was teaching was on the forefront, close to 40 years at the Board of Education. But before that, I taught at City College for about 30 some odd years. And that's another thing when we talk about Kamoinge and talk about artists, that everybody say you have Herbie, Lou Draper, Ray Francis, myself, Tony Vapo. So all of us wound up being instructors or teachers at some point. How many groups of photographers talk about artists? The founding members wound up being instructors and teachers mainly because of what we learned in being part of Kamoinge. I think I think it talks about the effect that it had on us and the effect that we had on our community. Yeah, go ahead. I think
Well, you talked already about Black Journal, so since we're gonna head to Cuba, I'm gonna move forward. I brought in Lou's photo of Girl in Cuba just to think a little bit about what Cuba meant in the US before, and you had thought a lot about that before you left for Cuba. So as we lead into the Cuba film, maybe you and Alan can just talk a little bit about how that came about, how you decided to go to Cuba and how you got there.
Let me just say, I'm going to jump in front of Alan this time. I don't know how it came about, but I know Alan insisted on me going, and I forget that. And it was a point where the rest of Third World Newsroom would have been very satisfied with me not having to have a Black guy with them, right? And Alan said, hey man, Sean's gone. You need to have a Black representative there if you're gonna do a film on Cuba. And we went to do a film on the Isle of Pines, which was an island across from, I think it was maybe a 4 or 5 hour ride from Havana. And the island there was nothing on the island but a hotel and a casino. And the casino and the hotel was for rich white folks to come gamble while their other halves had abortions. So there was an abortion clinic and a gambling joint on the Isle of Pines. And Cubans decided that they wanted to build a school and turn it into an educational institution. So that's what I know about the Isle of Pines. I don't know how many period of time. We spent a lot of time there because we were only supposed to be there. The halves had like, what, a week and a half? I don't know how much time, but I know it was more than a month. All right, Alan might know more about that. But I did the stills and, excuse me, I did the stills and the video. Alan?
You did the film. The film. It was film.
Well, how about I'll go ahead and play it, and then we can talk a little bit about it once we've shown it. Alan, I'm struck by dance in both of the videos, and the way that there's almost it feels like the Cuba film answers the community of control film in many ways. And so I wanted to know, were you editor for both? Did you play the role of editor for both of these?
I was editor on the community control, but not Isle of Youth. Not that I can remember.
How many films do you think Newsreel made in 1960? Well, these were released in 69, but I think that a lot of the footage was shot in 1968. How many films do you think you made in that first year?
Oh, between 10 and 20 films.
Okay.
Easily.
Yeah.
Easily.
That's incredible. And you talked, Alan, I asked you about subtitles at one point, and you explained part of the process, the speed with which you were turning these out, but it might also be helpful because I know that we have some young photography and film students. And as you pointed out, Sean was saying video and you were saying film. I think that we have lost a sense of what the process was of actually making these films.
Well, that's that's a rather long discussion. But if you think of, I'll just simplify it, is that video editing, digital editing, is based on film editing. Okay, it was basically taking the process of film editing and like transforming it into a digital process. But a lot of the methodology of editing and so forth was just expanded because digital devices gave you additional tools to work with. But I remember the Dee Allen was the film editor, and she worked on the film Reds. Okay, I don't know if any of you remember this film, but Dee Allen was the editor of this film, and it was the first film that was made using something like digital technology. She had a building, the editing studio on the west side in New York. It actually wasn't a studio, it was a series of floors in this building. And there was all kinds of like VHS tape recorders that were connected to computers, okay? And the original film that was transferred to VHS, and then the VHS machines were linked to computers, and this became like sort of the basis for Avid technology, which was like one of the first digital editing systems. So, but it was basically replicated a process that Dee Allen would have probably used if she was just editing a film without the digital technology, you know.
But now somebody could go on a trip. They could make a film. I mean, they could film something and they could upload it. You guys had to get that film out of Cuba. And I also should point out again, thinking about the younger people watching, that it was extraordinarily difficult for Americans to get in and out of Cuba at this particular moment. I mean, it still is, but at this particular moment,
Sean can tell you how difficult it was to get into Cuba, to just get into Cuba, because he had to go to Mexico in order to get into Cuba, because you couldn't go to Cuba directly, okay? You couldn't go, there was no plane that went from Miami to Havana. You had to go some circuitous route in order to get in, because there was a whole series of embargoes in terms of travel, in terms of products. Still, the embargo is still continuing.
And the FBI was all over the place. The trip to Cuba and the return trip from Cuba was like a James Bond movie for me. So here I am. I'm right off 117th Street, and I get thrown into a movie plot that you had to have, you had to have a cover story. So when you met people, they said, well, where are you going? Why are you here? And you said, well, I'm going somewhere, but not to Cuba. You never mentioned Cuba. You know, I'm going somewhere, I'm down on vacation. You had different cover stories. And the hotel we stayed in, everybody was going to Cuba pretty much, but you had to leave to catch a cab. You had to leave the hotel and walk about 5 blocks so people wouldn't know what hotel you're leaving from. And it just went on in that way. And the same thing with smuggling the film back, because I think we eventually had to leave the film in Canada. And some people from Canada brought it up because we had posters and books and all kinds of Cuban materials that we were trying to bring in, and the film just became just too much.
This is an important point. What Sean just mentioned is that this was when Newsreel went to Cuba, they brought out all of this material, and they brought out films that people had never seen before. So people had heard what conditions were like in Cuba, but they never saw it actually on film, and they never saw the way Cubans represented, like the way that they were transforming the society. And one of the films that we brought out, that Sean brought out, was Now, film Now. Okay, and the film Now was basically based on the song by Lena Horne, Now. Okay,
yeah, Santiago Alvarez.
Exactly. Santiago Alvarez edited a film using stills and newspaper photographs and so forth, and set it to the song by Lena Horne. And the song by Lena Horne was banned in the US. You couldn't hear it on the radio, okay? It was like, this film is like, no, can't play this song, okay? So it was like, not only could people hear the song, but they could see a reality of America that they couldn't see before, and it was coming from Cuba. It's amazing.
It is amazing. And Sean, one last, I would be remiss if I didn't ask you about this. You also lost the very Cuba photos that we showed earlier. You had those removed from an airplane at a later point in the US, right?
We had a show somewhere, and they literally stopped the plane and took the photographs of Cuba off the plane. I'm glad you mentioned that. I had forgotten all about it, but Kamoinge had a show at one of the universities, and they saw it, and when the show was coming back to New York, they took that. So when the rest of the photographs back to New York, my Cuban photographs were gone. So, and just to say that I was blacklisted from Cuba, so that I was working with Black Journal, making a decent salary. I was making $125 a shoot for Black Journal, and traveling all over the country. And my wife at the time was a social worker. She lost her job. I lost my job. I couldn't get a job anywhere. So that's eventually why I wound up going to Guyana, because a friend said, come on down and hang out here, see if we can get some work here. But that's how I got bad I got. And I'm a filmmaker, photographer, artist, and I'm not a political at some point. And my wife is also a worker. She let me see if we can get some work here. And I got the fundamentals of my political education about socialism. I have to say that. And I found the young people that were 5 years younger than me, were some of the most political astute young people I had met. And I remember when I would come home from the shoot, I would have to go up in my hotel. I had 2 books. I had a book by Mao, and I had a Little Red Book by Mao. Cuba was very, and I had another book by Fidel Castro, and another one by what's his name? I can't think of the other. Oh, and I had another book by Che Guevara. And I had to read captions of these things just to be able to come down to the stairs and have dinner and be able to hold a decent conversation. So I definitely learned my fundamentals of my political education in Cuba. So that's why I'm saying, and again, always thank you for that trip, Adam.
Thank you that you went there.
So we had a few more pictures, Sean, of your work, and we also had questions especially about the distribution of the films. So before we leave Cuba, I'm going to ask you one question. Somebody wanted to know, did your film ever show in Cuba? You brought Santiago Alvarez out and showed his film now in the US.
So,
were your films shown in Cuba?
You would have to ask Alan or JT at Third World News. I have no idea.
No, they were sure.
You got to remember, I saw that film, The Isle of Pines, recently, this year.
It just got
I never
digitized.
saw it before.
Yeah, so it just got digitized this year. So it's nobody's seen it in a long time.
So most of the films that we shot, we never saw it. We worked on it, got it finished, and on to
the next one.
The next project. And I have to say that I confuse it because I realized back in that video, once I switched to video, it became so easy that I call all of it, all of it's film, as far as I'm concerned. It's all moving image, whether it's electronic or celluloid. So for me, it doesn't make a difference as long as I worked on it, got it finished, and the deal is that because I should say that I video now, never thought I would get back to it, but that you can get a $500 camera, even less than that, you can get a $300 camera that'll fit in your shirt pocket, and you can shoot some fabulous video on it. So the whole, everybody's now shooting a $500 camera, even less than that, you can get a 300 film video, and now people with cell phones, you see that island on it. So the whole film thing it's a lost art. Everybody's now shooting film. We worked on it, got it finished. These are, I just like to say quick thing. There's a series of images of mine. I just like to say quick what my new work is, because like I said earlier, that it became very difficult to shoot people in the streets and walk into communities that you didn't know and shoot strangers. So I began to start dealing with more abstract, surrealist kind of stuff. So this is what the second part of the work that I've been doing for maybe the last 20 years is more about this surrealism and abstract work. And none of these are Photoshop, so these are all straight images.
Amazing.
Because I shoot video now, never thought that you can get.
Well, I thought I would close, Sean, because I think there's a big announcement, which this is the International Black Photographers newsletter from 1982, and you were a part of a call at that time. You really felt strongly that Black photographers should be establishing an archive for their work. and you were really promoting that, and you built an incredible archive over those years. And the Library of Congress now has acquired your archive. So I thought that might be a fitting place to end, because before we have, I think we've got about time for maybe one question, but I just wanted to make that an announcement. You've had this tremendous career. You have seen and participated in such important times, and now your work will be digitized and available at the Library of Congress so that people can continue to explore your phenomenal career.
Yeah, they actually took a lot of work. I was very surprised. It was sort of very serendipitous that I happened to know somebody who knew somebody, and that's how the work got there. But there's other Kamoinge members who have collected, and I think that was another thing I learned from being a part of Kamoinge, was collecting every piece of paper. I have a lot of material on Harlem. I have anytime somebody passed me something in the street, I take it. I don't care whether it was on hair braiding or the sex stuff that they used to have on 42nd Street, whatever it is, yeah. And I would carry it back so I would keep the stuff so it wouldn't get all bent up and folded. So I've been collecting stuff since 60s, late 50s. So there's still a lot of material that we're still trying to find a home for.
So I think this is a good question to
Okay.
close on for both you and Alan. Somebody wrote, I'm struck by how relevant these films are today. We are still fighting against many of the same forces, marching for the same demands. What advice do you have for young photographers and filmmakers in 2020 as far as documenting movements and leveraging their work in a way that keeps people motivated to keep going and hopefully finally get over? That's a big question, but very appropriate.
That was a good question that just sort of rattled my head for a minute. You know, I think the only thing I could really say to that, at some point we'll answer it, is that I don't know if Alan knew, but I surely didn't know that all of this stuff all this material that you've seen this evening was about dealing with our survival, liberation, freedom. So, like I said, some of the films that we didn't even see after we made them, that if you feel the necessity to get into a cause and you just shoot, you document it, one of the things is that I used to always like the freedom. I forgot what religious group they call themselves. Jehovah Witness. I'm a witness of my time. That's what I am. That's what to get into these young people need to be. You'll never know. I never knew that my collection would turn out to be what it was. I just knew that I wanted to be a witness of my time. I wanted to document as much as I could, and document, because I have as much document on. And I think you should always start at home. I'm a witness of family, your block, and then spread out as far as you can. If that's what you get of it, at some point you'll never know how important it'll be. I think that's my answer. I don't know if I wanted to document as much as I could, and document make any sense to anybody.
Makes a lot of sense to me. It makes a lot of sense
family,
to me.
Your block, and then spread out.
I mean, when you look at Kamoinge and you look at what has come out of it, and the history, the culture that is represented there, it speaks to how people should continue to be working today. Not in the same way, but adapting. Adapting some kind of collaborative process and applying it to the conditions that we are living under today, okay? And finding a way to get the work out, That's really important. It was like really important for newsreel. Someone did mention that how these films were distributed. That newsreel created a distribution network for the films, okay? And that network was like really critical. One of the early films that Newsreel made in '68 was about the Black Panthers, okay? And that film was distributed by the Black Panthers, okay, by Black Panther organizations all across the United States. They all virtually had a copy of that film, and they showed that film in the community. And that was part of the whole educational process that the Panthers, like, you included in being able to talk to people about what they were doing, why they were doing it, and the successes that they were having in what they were doing. So in terms of like today, we need to recognize that there is not this division between like being an artist and being an activist, or being an artist and being connected to your community, okay? We live in a society where everything that you do is like commodified, and the only way that, if you can only think of yourself as an artist, as a commodity, then you have to think of like, well, maybe you should just be taking photographs of Nikes, you know, or like Adidas or something like that, you know, not the people that you live around and the things that you experience each day. So I mean, you have to make these kind of connections, and you have to recognize that there's like certain forces that are inhibiting making those connections.
Thank you. Those are great answers. And I also think I want to point out to any professors and teachers that are watching that these films are available at Third World Newsreel, and that I hope we learn from these films. I hope that we study what is available from the past as we face the current moment. And I think that you guys have, the theme of the Africana Film Festival, this is a great place to end on, I think, is the shoulders we stand on. And you have offered us some really important shoulders that we are standing on in this current moment. And I think that it's just an incredible privilege to be able to learn from both of you. And I'm so grateful that you shared your time and that you made these films. Thank you very much.
Sure, I'd like to say one thing before you sign off, is that I think you should promote the Black Photographers Annual on your site, that when people want to see what we've done and how we got our beginnings, and so you have all the annuals there and they can see, I think you should put that information out there to let them people to, you know, if they're interested in what we're doing now, just to see the first product that we had our hands on and what we were able to produce back in the 70s.
That's a great advertisement for, so next week, the theme will be Ming Smith and Herb Robinson talking with John Mason about jazz, but the following week, it will be Buford Smith and Bill Gaskins talking primarily about the Black Photographers Annual. So we'll have a whole session dedicated to the annual. But those resources, yes, please, the Kamoinge Workshop virtual website has everything from the exhibition and has the annual as well. And we will send out an email tomorrow that has some of these resources listed so people can find them. I'm just so grateful to the audience for tuning in, and really grateful to both of you for this evening, which has been amazing. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Izzy, really for putting this all together and keeping this reality alive and making it available to people. It's really so important that you did this, you know.
Yeah,
very
same
important.
here. Izzy, again, thanks for your contribution. And wouldn't have done without you, because, and I have some help here that, you know, because this whole technology thing is over my head. So I'm glad that I've been able to tune into this piece. And just thank you guys, and look forward to seeing the rest of the video of the broadcast.
Thank you, Sean, Alan, and Sarah, and we'll see everyone next week.
Bye-bye.